Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley, Part 8, Dramatic Ending. Now, as per usual, you need to have read, watched or studied this play, and you should be using this video for revision or maybe to gain a better understanding of what happens at the end of this morality play. So in this video, I'll start by looking at the plot in this final section. We'll look at key characters, themes, context, and quotes you may want to commit to memory ahead of your assessments. And I'll leave you with a writing question that you can answer if you wish to practice. So, what happens in Part 8, Dramatic Ending? Just a reminder that Priestley's play is actually made up of 3 acts, but I have subdivided it into 8 different parts to make it easier to break down and study. So Part 8, Dramatic Ending, goes from the stage direction "he walks straight out," so when Inspector Goole leaves the stage, all the way to the end of the play when it literally says "end of play." So what's happening in this section? Well, Inspector Goole has left and the Burling family start blaming each other for what happened to Eva Smith. And Sheila wonders if Inspector Goole was actually a real police inspector or not. And to Sheila and Eric, it doesn't matter whether Inspector Goole is real, because what he did in inspecting the Burling family has woken them up, has alerted them to the fact that they need to change. However, to Arthur and Sybil, to Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling, it matters a great deal, because if Inspector Goole is not a real police inspector, then this scandal doesn't need to come to air. Mr. Burling can keep his shiny reputation and get his knighthood, and Mrs. Burling, doesn't have to have any of the shame or blame associated with it. So clearly, Arthur and Sybil are quite keen to return to their old ways, cover up this rotten affair with Eva Smith, and get back to the way things were before. However, Sheila and Eric can't do this. What Inspector Goole has done and said and showed them has permanently changed them. And this is a conflict between the older generation and the younger generation. The older generation do not change, whereas the younger generation do. It's about this time that Gerald returns to the stage. He left the stage and he has now returned, and his dramatic entrance brings with it some information. Gerald reveals that he suspects Inspector Goole is a fake inspector. And if this is true, then of course Arthur and Sybil are going to be delighted. So to confirm this suspicion, Arthur calls Colonel Roberts to double check. Now remember, Arthur has had a past as being a magistrate, so he is quite powerful within Bromley, and he's able to contact the colonel who is in charge of the police force in the area. So he goes straight to the top chief and he asks, "Do you have an Inspector Goole?" And he describes Inspector Goole. And Colonel Roberts says, "No, I've never heard of him." So as a result of this, Arthur and Sybil are delighted because they can cover up the rotten affair with Eva Smith and they can go back to living their wonderful, comfortable lives. However, Sheila and Eric have changed and they cannot. And they actually find it frightening that their mother and father want to pretend and go back to the way things were before, and that they haven't learnt anything and show no signs of wanting to change from their bad behaviour. Gerald takes it one step further and he suggests that actually Inspector Goole might not be real. Maybe Eva Smith isn't real. Or if she is real, maybe she's an amalgamation, a collection of many different women. And he bases this argument on the fact that no 2 characters saw the same photo of her. Mr. Burling saw a photo, but then Inspector Goole put that photo away. So when he showed Sheila, we don't know if it's the same photo or a different photo. Gerald didn't even need a photo. When he heard the name Daisy Renton, he admitted to knowing this girl. And again, when it came to Mrs. Burling, we don't know what photo the inspector showed. Was it the same one? Was it a different one? And when it came to Eric, he didn't even show a photo at all. At this stage, everyone believed it was the same Eva Smith that Eric had encountered at that night at the Palace Bar. So, Arthur and Sybil are really excited at the fact that Eva Smith may not be real, because if Inspector Goole isn't real and Eva Smith isn't real, there's definitely no scandal. There's definitely no shame, no guilt, no blame, and they can go back to living the way things were. But again, Sheila and Eric have changed. They said even if an Eva Smith wasn't killed, we still did those things we did. We still had her fired, Mr. Burling and Sheila did. We still turned her away from charity. Mrs. Burling did that. We still raped. Eric did that. So nothing really has changed for Sheila and Eric. They've learnt their lesson and they want to change. But for Arthur and Sybil, they're really quick to try to go back to continuing in their old habits. So, to confirm, Gerald phones the infirmary, which is kind of like a hospital, and relays that no women have been brought in for suicide from drinking disinfectant. In fact, there were no suicides at all. So at this stage of the play, it seems like Inspector Gould is a fake and Eva Smith is a fake, like it's a hoax, and that's the words that Mr. Burling and Gerald use. So at this stage, they're quite delighted, at least Arthur and Sybil are, that nothing has come of this. It's just a practical joke someone's played on them, and they can all go back to living life as they did at the start of the play. Sheila and Eric have clearly changed because they refuse to do this. They're frightened that their parents haven't learnt anything, and they can't believe that they're pretending to go back to their old ways. Arthur and Sybil, on the other hand, cannot wait to put this behind them and to return to how they behaved before. In fact, things almost seem back to normal. Gerald even asks Sheila whether she'll take the ring back, but Sheila says no, she has to wait before she gets engaged again. And actually, at this stage, Mr. Burling again comes across as quite arrogant, and he looks at Sheila and Eric and goes, ha ha ha, the younger generation. You should have seen your faces when the inspector was interrogating you. You can't even take a joke. And right when Arthur Burling and Sybil Burling are back to their sort of upper class and capitalistic arrogance, the telephone rings. Mr. Burling answers it, and we discover that a police inspector is on his way to interrogate the Burlings and Gerald in relation or in connection with a girl committing suicide by drinking disinfectant. And dramatically, that is how the play ends, which is why I call it dramatic ending. So what we have here is kind of a false ending. We have an ending where the inspector might not be real and Eva might not be real, and then we have a counter ending, if you will, where actually it turns out they both probably are real. It's almost as if the whole play is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen at the end of the play. Now, why does Priestley do this? I think Priestley does this to raise a question, and the question is, does it matter? Does it matter if Inspector Gould is not real? Does it matter if Eva Smith is not real? And I think the answer is no, it doesn't matter, because ultimately, capitalists, as represented by Mr. Burling, are exploiting the working class, whether this Eva Smith character is real or not. Ultimately, the upper classes, as represented by Sybil Burling, Mrs. Burling, are refusing to help the working classes, whether or not this Eva Smith character was real or not. So I think what we get is a message from Priestley saying it doesn't even matter if Eva Smith's real or Inspector Gould's real. From a moral point of view, we all need to inspect ourselves and make sure what we're doing is ethical and right. And from a social point of view, it shouldn't be a case of knowing individual working class girls to help them. It should be a case of helping all working class women. So I think that's why the false ending is put there. But then for a bit of added drama, there's a twist, and it turns out it is real, that potentially there is an Eva Smith and an Inspector Gould coming to interrogate the Burlings and Gerald. So the main character I want to look at here is the Burling family as a whole. And each character represents something different. So Arthur Burling is a symbol for capitalism. And we know through the technique dramatic irony that Priestley presents Arthur Burling as rather stupid and arrogant. And as a result, he's trying to criticise capitalism. Because remember, J.B. Priestley is an advocate and wants to promote socialism because he thinks that will better benefit a post-war British society. We move on to his wife Sybil Burling, and she's a symbol for the upper classes. And this is she's presented by Priestley as someone quite detestable. The stage direction at the beginning actually says a rather cold woman. And the way she goes, oh, I did my duty. Oh, girls of that class. Oh, I have no sympathy for Eva Smith. Her sort of arrogance and conceitedness the audience would find an anger towards. And I think that's done on purpose. I think J.B. Priestley wants to audience his post-war British audience to stir up a bit of anger towards the upper classes and the way they behave. And we call this a social commentary. Priestley is commenting on the society he lived in. Sheila and Eric, I think, are symbols for the younger generation, and they show that they can change. Have you ever heard the phrase, you can't teach an old dog new tricks? If you get a dog that's maybe 10 years old and you try to get it to, I don't know, chase a ball or do a flip or whatever dogs do, it's just not interested. Whereas if you get a younger dog, a puppy, and you try to teach it things, it's so keen and willing to learn. In the same way, Sheila and Eric are willing to change. They see the error of their parents' ways, they see the error of the ways they're walking in, and they change. And I think Priestley uses them to inspire his post-war British audience. He's almost putting them on a pedestal and saying, look, if Sheila and Eric can change, why can't you change? Why can't we all change to make a better Britain? So, what themes do we have here? I just want to recap all the themes we've looked at in this video series and how you might want to link them to this final section. So we've looked at class, responsibility, older versus younger generation, exploitation, gender, guilt, and socialism. In this final scene, we get the theme of class when we see Mrs. Burling, who represents the upper classes. You could link it to the theme of responsibility. At the start of this section, none of the Burlings wanted to take responsibility. They were all blaming each other. You have the older versus younger generation theme, where the older generation can't change and don't want to change from their ways, whereas the younger generation do change and can change. We get the idea that the whole family exploited Eva Smith, and now they're trying to cover it up. We get gender roles displayed, particularly when, for example, Mr. Burling sort of takes charge of the situation and restores his former arrogance, and the treatment of Eva Smith. We get themes of guilt, so Sheila and Eric feel guilt, and that sort of inspires their change and their desire to change, whereas Arthur Burling and Sybil Burling want to quickly cover up their feelings of guilt and set it aside and move on with their lives as it was before. And of course we get this idea of socialism, that if they were socially responsible and looked after each other, then the inspector would never have to come in the first place. But then we get that dramatic ending where there's a phone call, there's a dead girl who's drunk disinfectant, and an inspector coming to interrogate them, which reinforces the need for socialism in this family and in post-war Britain. I want to do a similar thing with context. I want to recap the different contextual knowledge we've looked at and how you might tie it into the end of the play. So we looked at capitalism and socialism, class divide, hierarchy, women's suffrage, prostitution, and J.B. Priestley himself. When it comes to capitalism, Mr. Burling is our symbol for capitalism, and we see at the end here that Priestley saying if capitalism continues in society, we will have people who don't take social responsibility, who try to cover up things, and society never progresses. So the alternative to that, as far as Priestley is concerned, is to introduce socialism into society. And that's what Sheila and Eric are going to go on to do by resisting their parents and by advocating change. We see the class divide. We see how the upper classes can get away with treating the working class, such as Eva Smith, so badly to the point that Eva Smith commits suicide, and then they just cover it up, or at least try to cover it up, and move on with life. Again, we get this sense of hierarchy where the upper class can exploit the working class with little to no consequence, particularly when they thought Inspector Gould was not real and they thought that Eva Smith was not real. They were using their power, symbolised through the telephone. That's quite an expensive device back then, so they were able to call Colonel Roberts, they were able to call the infirmary, use their influence, use their power to get rid of their guilt, and that's done through the social hierarchy. We see attitudes to women again when Mr. Burling sort of takes charge at the end, as he did at the beginning of the play. We see the attitude that he takes towards Sheila, oh, you're being hysterical. We see the attitude they take towards Eva Smith, that actually she's sort of dead and gone and out the way and they can move back on with their lives. We get the theme of suffrage that we can closely link with the treatment of women and the need for the suffrage movement to advocate greater women's rights at the time. Again, you could link this to prostitution, although it's probably not as clear a link at the end of the play as it is when we see Eva Smith in the middle of the play. And finally, you've got J.B. Priestley, who of course you can definitely bring in at the end as a powerful advocate for socialism. And he does this through his presentation of characters, and particularly with this dramatic ending. Does it matter whether the socialist Inspector Gould is alive or dead? The Burlings seem to think it doesn't matter, but Priestley thinks it matters, so he brings him back in that dramatic ending, in that twist at the end. So, what key quotes might you want to commit to memory from the final section of this play? Sheila says, "You don't seem to have learnt anything." Here the pronoun you is referring to her parents, and actually she's quite critical, which is unusual for the younger generation to speak up against the older generation. But she's saying, you haven't learned anything from Inspector Gould, you're going back to your old ways, that's not okay. Eric agrees with Sheila, and he says he was our police inspector, all right. This is after Mr. Burling said he's not a real police inspector. Eric says, well, he was our inspector, he inspected us, all right. Sheila uses this idiom, up to the neck. I'm up to the neck in trouble. Their family is up to the neck in it because of how they treated Eva Smith. That technique is an idiom. Bitterly. If you want to talk about this adverb, you'd want to talk about it as a stage direction. I suppose we're all nice people now, Sheila says. She's being sarcastic here. This is after her parents are quite happy to cover up what they've done, because Inspector Gould is not real and Eva Smith is not real, and they pretend to go back to behaving how they were before, and Sheila sarcastically goes, oh well, I guess we're nice people. This really shows Sheila's maturity from being quite naive and sheltered at the start of the play in Act 1 to now being almost critical and being almost a secondary inspector, another advocate for socialism and speaking out against her parents. Eric says, I say the girl's dead and we all helped to kill her. This is a great quote for social responsibility. The pronoun we places the guilt and the blame on his entire family. Sheila then says, but that won't bring Eva Smith back to life, will it? This is what we'd call a tag question. So there's a statement that won't bring Eva Smith back to life, and then a question is tagged on the end, will it? What Sheila does here is she values people over money, and she realizes that the whole learning curve from this experience is that as a family, the Burling family have committed actions that have led to the consequence of Eva Smith dying. But Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling don't see that as important. What they see as important is protecting their reputation and covering up this scandal, this hoax. But Sheila's really seen to the heart of the problem, what Priestley wants to teach the audience, and that's that we've got to value humans over reputation, over money. Gerald and Arthur keep using this word hoax to try and cover it up, but at the end we realise it's not a hoax when they get a phone call and there's a girl dead at the infirmary and there's a police inspector on their way. You lot may be letting yourselves out nicely, but I can't. Eric says this when his mum and dad try to go back pretending to how things were before. And actually Gerald tries to go back to pretending to how things were before, but Eric says, I can't go back to it. And from that we learned that he's changed, and you could link that to the theme of older versus younger generation. The younger generation can change, and that's who Priestley is targeting with his play. He wants to inspire the young post-war British audience to change, and change to socialism. It frightens me the way you talk. Sheila says this. I would look at the verb frightens. She's actually upset and terrified at her parents' ability to ignore Eva Smith's death and go back to the way things were before. Now remember, Mr. Burling represents capitalism, Mrs. Burling represents the upper classes. So what Priestley is saying through Sheila is it should frighten the audience that capitalists and that upper class people can treat the working classes, can treat their fellow men and women of the earth like that, and just not care about it and get away with it. And Sheila says, you're pretending everything's just as it was before. This word pretend is used by both Sheila and Eric And it's really the younger generation clashing with the older generation, saying you want to go back to the way things were before, but we don't want to pretend anymore. We've learned something. We want to change. We want to overcome these entrenched problems that are passed from generation to generation. And it's these quotes that I think Priestley is hoping will inspire his audience, particularly the younger ones in his audience, to go against what their parents might have thought, to go against what society thinks is normal, which is capitalism and classism, and to try and forge a new and better post-war Britain through socialism, through equality, through treating people fairly. So, if you want to practice your writing, I've got a nice thematic question for you here. Explore the differences between the older and younger generation in An Inspector Calls. I've left that quite open, so you maybe want to divide your writing into 3 bodies, 3 paragraphs, one for Act 1, and how the older generation treat the younger generation there. Maybe you could look at Mr. Burling's speech and the way Mrs. Burling lectures Sheila on how to behave and what to expect of married life. You could then maybe move on to the middle of the play, Act 2, and you might want to look at the clashes that appear between Sheila and her father, Eric and Mrs. Burling, etc. And then you can dedicate your final body paragraph to maybe the end of the play in Act 3, how the younger generation have changed, but the older generation are stuck in their ways. And of course, you can always make notes from this video on a physical copy of the play, and that way you've turned it into a nice revision guide ahead of your exams. Well, I hope you liked this video and found this series on Inspector Calls useful. I'll be adding to it and adding more resources in the future, so keep an eye out on this space. Please give this video a like, please consider subscribing to my channel, and leave a comment if you think I've left anything out or you'd like to see videos about other An Inspector Calls related topics and themes and contexts. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.